Ukraine. We had Putin putting out some preconditions before the summit in Switzerland. He wanted to influence the summit. He wanted to say what Russia thinks at this particular moment. On the other hand, we are witnessing right now, it seems that NATO is seeking some sort of escalations. We had Orban talking about this, that NATO wants to do some sort of operations and that Hungary would not be part of this. We had the president of Serbia talking about in 2-3 months we're gonna have a world war.
Well, Nima, thank you for having me on. Let me start with Ukraine and say that I just don't understand why NATO thinks it can reverse the trajectory of Russian victory. It really bothers me greatly because there's no way that can be done short of the introduction of tactical nuclear weapons. NATO has such political stakes in what happens in Ukraine, and especially the US during election year, and there are elections coming in Europe as well, that there are personal and political factors at play here. The personal ones having to do mostly in the United States with the political fortunes of the coterie of young advisors that Biden has around him. It's not only Biden, it's not only his son that have lots of evidence against them for bribery and other things, but it's also Lincoln and Sullivan who have committed clearly on the record what most people would consider to be crimes against the law. So what makes them think that they can deal with this by escalating? It boggles the mind. So McGovern says instinctively, well, they can't be serious. My God, McGovern has been wrong. Back in February 2022, I thought to myself, well, hey, wait a second, this looks like a real break. Biden promised Putin that he wouldn't put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. That's a biggie. Okay, when did he do that? The day before New Year's Eve, 2021. Well, was going on the assumption that that would be in the negotiations, and that would give the Russians pause, because that meant fully 4 of the 7 provisions they had in terms of that treaty that they were circulating, not only with the US, but with NATO. It seemed to me that this was the first acknowledgement that the US was taking Russian concerns seriously. And not only me, Ushakov, the main man for Putin on these matters, said the same thing. Finally, they're listening to us. Well, I also thought that Putin, being a very, very cautious person, would not invade Ukraine alone. Why do I say alone? Well, because I asked my American Chinese analyst friends, would Xi Jinping support an invasion of Ukraine? And to a person, they said, well, you're crazy? Of course not. That's the bedrock notion in Chinese foreign policy. Westphalia, okay, no interference in other people's affairs, no invasions, no. So forget about it. The Chinese aren't going to support that. Well, they were wrong, and I was wrong, because just a couple of weeks before the invasion, with Putin in Beijing, it seems clear now that Xi Jinping said, okay, we'll carve out an exception to Westphalia for you all. We'll even change our rhetoric. We won't say Westphalia anymore. We'll say critical points. We'll say vital interests, key interests of major states have to be cited first and foremost. And this is what the rhetoric said, each situation has to be looked at and decided upon on its own merits. Whoa, that's a big change from Westphalia, but it happened almost immediately. Now they're back, of course, to Westphalia and the other. So what I'm saying here is I was really surprised that this would happen, but it did. Then I was surprised like everyone else, I saw those tanks drawn up in mile-long columns there near Kiev, and I said to myself, "Why don't they? What are they doing there? You know, why don't they go?" Well, it's clear to me now that negotiations were going on, really heavy negotiations, hard and fast, first in Belarus and then down in Istanbul. Okay. Now, who is leading those delegations? The one from Ukraine was headed by a very close friend, a close inner circle friend of Zelensky. His name is David Arachmania. Arachmania. I have to try to memorize that word because it's really important. Okay. Now, when was Arachmania appointed to negotiate with the Russians? Nima, would you believe February 28th, 2022? How many days is that after the Russian invasion? If my math is right, that's 4 days. It goes up to Belarus, ends up leading this delegation in Istanbul, and they come to an agreement. The agreement was pretty much ready on the 28th, 29th of March. So we're talking 6 weeks after the invasion, okay? Now what happened? He initialed the agreement, but then Boris Johnson came in from London on the 6th of April and said, "You better not do this. We won't support you. No support from the West. Reject that. Fight on." Now, how do I know he said that? Arachmania has testified. He's told the press exactly that story. We were ready to sign after all this work, starting on the 28th of February. It's willing to sign it, and then Johnson comes in and says, "No, don't sign." Okay. As a matter of fact, the Russians had, as a matter of building confidence, withdrawn those troops from around Kiev. That's fact. We know they withdraw the troops. Most thought, well, because they got a bloody nose and didn't want to continue. But Putin and others are now claimed, at least, that that was a gesture of goodwill. But with Boris Johnson, Johnson, of course, was acting on behalf of the U.S. and NATO and the U.K. So that was testified to by the lead Ukrainian negotiator, who, as I said, is like this with Zelensky himself, right? And is head of Zelensky's party faction in the parliament in Kiev, in the Rada. Okay, so this is not some outlier. So he told this to the press. He told this to the press a year ago. Okay, we knew about it. I said, "What's happening?" Those of us who follow the press were reading it in Ukrainskaya Pravda, for God's sake. You know, Johnson came in, this is what happened. But now it's revealed by the chief negotiator for Ukraine. What happens? Well, the US and Western media suppress this, okay? Because it's dynamite. I mean, hello, the whole thing could have been ended. 500,000 or so young Ukrainian men would still be alive, okay? If that thing was allowed to go through. That's fact, okay? We know that now. And again, you're not depending on my analysis, you're depending on what the chief negotiator for Ukraine has said and confirmed, of course, by the Russians. So what does that mean? Well, it means that people have to take into account this, what they call the Istanbul Accord, even though it was just initial. So they have to sort of make believe they know about it. And that's precisely what the New York Times did exactly a week ago. So last Saturday, they published some excerpts from the various drafts, and they had this big story about the whole thing. But guess what they forgot to say? They forgot to say that it was so close to an agreement that it had to be nullified by Johnson's visit, and that was why it didn't succeed. They reversed it, the New York Times. They said, "Oh, there was an upsurge of fighting, and then there was a Bucha massacre, a stage massacre." You could talk to Scott Ritter about that. He wrote chapter and verse about that. So that was to help the Ukrainians reject this whole thing of dealing with Russia. Now, one extension of this, of course, Nima, is that if the American people knew from the New York Times that instead of this obfuscation with respect to this accord, this Istanbul Accord, if they knew that it had been reached, if they knew that it was initial, and that if it had been allowed to go through, the war would have ended in 6, 7, 8 weeks, okay? Then they would think, my God, what kind of leadership do we have here in Washington? And then they would also think, and this is key, okay? They would think, wow, you mean the Russians were prepared to stop in April of 2022? I mean, they hadn't even taken over all the Donbass, and they were initial this thing to stop. Well, what does that mean about their intentions to, after Ukraine, they won't stop with Ukraine. They'll go take the rest of Ukraine and maybe Poland and the Baltic states, and God knows they'll be on the beaches of Dunkirk before you know it. So this is Quatsch. This is what the British call bollocks. Okay, it's just all so strange, and it wouldn't be so bad except the president of the United States is fostering this view of what the Russian intentions are. So just to sum up in layman's terms, they stopped when they scared the hell out of the Ukrainians. Okay, the Ukrainians agreed to remain neutral. They agreed not to join NATO. That was a sine qua non for Putin. Okay. Now he in turn agreed to say, okay, well, you could join the EU. That's no problem. And we'll get some guarantees for you. We'll get maybe the big five to sort of say that they'll guarantee that we won't attack you, but and we'll leave the rest of the stuff to Crimea and exactly what happens to the Donbass later. But we'll have a ceasefire, for God's sake. Let's stop the fighting. Let's stop people from being killed. Now, if the world knew that, and the European press is no better than the American press, in my view, if the world knew that, it would be very embarrassing for people who claim that Putin's objectives are to take over all of Europe, but also be hard to understand how it can be that European and U.S. leaders could be so cruel as to sacrifice 500,000 Ukrainian kids just to give Russia a black eye, which the opposite has happened. So the Russians say that they're trying to give us a strategic defeat. They're not succeeding. And Putin on the 14th of June said, okay, here are our terms. He laid down his cards. Okay. So neutrality for Ukraine, pulling out Ukrainian troops from the 4 provinces that we have annexed, leave Crimea alone, an immediate ceasefire, and then we'll talk. Now that sounds pretty inflexible. Well, in a sense it is. I mean, but it comes of the fact that Russia has pretty much just won the war, okay? And there is some flexibility in it. I think you and I have, for months now, Nima, we've talked about Odessa and how in October of the year before last, Putin left that open, saying, Odessa could be a Yabloko, but I was going, it could be an apple of discord, the Trojan War, or it could be a way to come to meet, to get irreconcilable differences reconciled. Now, he hasn't said a word about Odessa this time. What does that mean? I don't want to exaggerate the significance of that, but the fact that he doesn't mention it, nor does he mention what happens to Kharkov there, or Kiev itself. If I were Putin, the last thing I would want to do is occupy, first subdue, fight over, and then occupy a city of 3 million, Kiev, 1 million Kharkov. Yes, less than 1 million, I think, or maybe more than 1 million. Anyhow, why would he want to do that when most of the people in Kharkov and Odessa are Russian speaking in any case. And in Kiev, I don't know, probably have about half and half that are sympathetic. At least they don't want Kiev to be leveled. So what I'm saying here is that as inflexible as Putin's terms sound, he's left some flexibility there. The problem is that the West, the US, and this fellow Stoltenberg never get it through their head that they're losing, okay? That the trajectory of this war is against them and has been now for a whole year, okay? And what worries me, of course, is what I said before: is how do they plan to deal with the fact when Putin says, "All right, armed forces go all the way to the Dnieper River," uh, what are they going to do then? Well, it's a political year for millions of people, and will they? I mean, if you look at the record of the people advising Biden, not only are they wet behind the ears in terms of real experience in political affairs and international affairs, but also in military affairs, okay? None of them have ever put a uniform on, for God's sake. Maybe they were a Boy Scout. I haven't checked that out, okay? Austin is a cipher. And to the degree he's in play at all, it's because he's doing his usual thing, that is making the intelligence say what the president wants to hear. So what's going to happen? I don't know. The last fly in the ointment that I mentioned is that yesterday, Trump said that, the administration's policy, the Biden administration really missed the boat, because all they wanted to do is, all the Russians really wanted was neutrality, was for Ukraine not to join NATO. And, all this rhetoric and all these threats and all that's got us into this fix. Now, as you know, I hold no brief for Donald Trump, but on this, as in several other key things, he happens to be correct, okay? And how will that play out next week when there's a debate? So that all, and one last thing, as the Russians look on President Biden, well, they've watched the same clips that we all have on the internet. They see someone who's unpredictable. They see somebody who's impaired, at least physically, and perhaps mentally. Now, Putin has said explicitly that what he prefers, what the Russians look for, what they hope for dearly, is predictability on the part of a president. Predictability. That, incidentally, is why I never bought the myth that they preferred Trump. My God. Anyhow, that's another story, another sad story, but another story. So predictability. Now, here's somebody who you can't predict is going to turn in the right direction or find his way off a stage or say the right thing in a prepared speech. I think that, generally speaking, Putin is riding high, but he's smart enough to realize that this could all change in a second, that there is no predictability on the part of these people advising Biden. And who has their fingers on these nuclear codes, after all? And would somebody think about using small nuclear weapons to prevent a definitive defeat in Ukraine before the election? As you know, I've said all along that I would not rule that out. That's a terrible thing to say, isn't it? But I wouldn't rule it out. And, it doesn't matter what I rule out or not. I don't think Putin could rule that out. And so, as relaxed and as strong as he appears, and I think he feels that way, he's mindful. He has to be. His military is breathing down his neck, saying, well, look, this guy is unpredictable. Look what he's doing. He's even trying to take out some of our early warning strategic missile sites. My God, what's going on here? We have to be on high alert. So I stop this little monologue with that warning that things are more tentative than I've ever seen them in a nuclear nuclear exchange possibility. And I've been around for many decades. The worst part, of course, is that the two sides have no established authority, no established channel to converse with one another. I mean, I don't know if Putin wanted to get a message to Biden, who would they call? Last time he called Biden, that was Biden reneged on that promise not to put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. They talked one more time. That was on the February the 12th of 2022. And that ended when Putin asked about this promise. And according to Ushakov in the Russian readout, he was told, forget about it. There's no promise. And besides, we're going to have Ukraine in NATO. Now, that was the 12th of February, 2022. That was 12 days before the war started. And I could go on, but I think I'll spare the reader more words right now. Thank you for letting me talk about this, Nima.
Yeah. When it comes to the anniversary of Hitler's invasion of Russia, that is so important for Russians and for all of us around the world, how you can explain for us, for our audience, the importance of this?
Well, this is the day in 1941 when the Wehrmacht, supported by other troops and contingents from Europe, invaded Russia. It's a day that all Russians hold sacred. There are lots of ceremonies going on right now. About 5 years ago, yeah, it was about 2015, maybe that's more than 5 years ago. Putin made a very big speech on this day. I think the title they gave it, why is every eye got a tear in it on this particular day? Well, without going into gory detail, we know that the Germans exacted a terrible price on Russia. Everyone has now come to the figure of 27 million dead, okay? Today, I'm told by my friend Gil Doctorow that they've broken it down. The Russians have said it was 8 million armed forces, 19 million civilians, okay? Now, 27 million is a whole lot. Everyone is aware of that. By comparison, U.S. forces lost, I think the latest figure, about 440,000 on both fronts, okay, together, aggregate. So you can compare the numbers, if you will. Worst of all, the Russians are painfully aware that we don't know what it's like to be invaded, to be attacked, to be decimated, to lose so many citizens as well as armed forces people. And Lavrov, the foreign minister, made note of this about a year ago in warning in a very unusual way. Look, this time, those two oceans that have protected you in the past, they don't protect you anymore. Please be aware of that. Of course, he's referring to the rocketry and the missiles that are available these days to be used. So the Russians knowing that, and then looking at Sullivan and Blinken, for God's sake, neither of whom have had any military experience, and who take their military intelligence, so to speak, from the likes of Lloyd Austin, was a long record of adulterating, of changing substantive intelligence to mesh more properly with what the president wants to hear. He did that under Obama with respect to Syria. He was called on the carpet by over 50 of his own analysts and analysts from the Defense Intelligence Agency who filed Inspector General report saying, look, he's falsified. We're telling the truth. And he makes it sound very rosy as soon as he gets to the White House. So look at him. They looked into it. They appointed a general, but this general with not 4 stars like Austin. And you know what happens when an inspector general investigation happens to a 4-star? Nothing happens. And so they said, oh, there was some evidence, but no. So anyhow, this is the guy that is advising Biden to say, and actually the head of the CIA, Bill Burns, to say, this is almost exactly a year ago. Burns, I think on the 2nd of July last year, Russia has suffered a strategic defeat in Ukraine. And the ineptitude of its armed forces has been laid bare. 6 days later, Biden happens to be in Helsinki. He says, Putin has already lost this war. He suffered a strategic defeat. Okay, now, that was less than a year ago, okay? Where are the pundits? Where are the journalists to ask the president, what happened? Now you're telling us that you need billions and billions and billions of. Now they already lost. How does that? Well, it's attributable to the terrible intelligence that has been served up by Austin, who I would remind people has the only military analysis group in the government. It used to be that CIA had its own military analysis capability, and we often called the Pentagon, called them short on many of the things they were saying in Vietnam, for example. That exists no more. So when the head of the CIA wants to know what's going on, he can't go to his own people. No, there's no capability. He goes to General Austin, who has this record that I just explained. So what we have is a situation where the president has been at the mercy of these people, and they don't seem to care very much. And what is the ace in the hole they think they have? My God, you know what I'm going to say. It begins with N for nuclear. These just light, these very low yield nuclear weapons. We have them. They're on the shelf there. We use cluster munitions. We ran out of 155 millimeter shell, but that's next. And why don't we? We can't lose the war, Mr. President, because then we lose the election. And my God, if that other fellow comes in, we could lose our freedom. I mean, they got the goods on a lot of us. So let's escalate some more. And so that's why, even though Putin has laid his cards on the table, I think everyone will be surprised, including Putin, if something sensible comes back in reaction, rather more and more escalation on the part of the West. And it's getting very, very dangerous, especially if the Ukrainians, with guidance systems they have to have from the US and NATO, start hitting early warning radar sites necessary to protect Russia from intercontinental ballistic missiles. I want to add just something that occurred to me having to do with this special day, and that is that I happen to be in Crimea, in Yalta, with an unofficial delegation. 2016 it was. So it was right after all those sanctions had been put in place, after the coup in Kiev, and no American delegations had appeared in Russia at any time. We were unofficial, but we were Americans, okay? Now, it happened to be that we were in Yalta on that day, on today in 2016, the day of the Nazi invasion of Russia. And since we were there, and since we were causing quite some attention, since we were the first American delegation there, we were asked to say a few words. And since I was the only Russian speaker in the delegation, I get up and I looked at these people and I said, my God, most of them are older than I am. I was 2 years old when this happened, 1941. These people seem to have been around longer than that. They all have an immediate taste for this. And so I drew from my education in Russian poetry, and I said, what could I possibly recite that would be relevant here? And into my mind came a poem by Nekrasov. He's described, he was active about the same time as Dostoevsky, described as the poet Ruskoy Skorby, the poet of Russian grief. Okay. And I said, if you remember that, McGovern, then maybe this would be a time to draw on that memory and recite it for the Russians, because I think they could really relate to it. The name of the poem is Немая ужасом войны. Ужас. It's almost onomatopoeia. Ужас. Horrors. Horrors. So paying attention to the ужасом войны, of war. Внимая ужасом войны, при каждой новой жертве боя, мне жаль ни друга, ни жены, мне жаль ни самого героя. Увы, утешится жена, и друга лучший друг забудет, а где-то есть душа одна, она до гроба помнить будет. При лицемерных наших тел и всякой пошлости и прозы одни я в мире подсмотрел святые, искренние слезы, то слезы бедных матерей. Им не забыть своих детей, погибших на кровавой ниве. Как не понять плохую шаиве своих поникнувших ветвей. Did a translation into English. It's loses a lot of translation, but this is what it means. Paying attention to the horrors of war. At the fall of each hero, I feel sorry not so much for the best friend of this hero or for his wife. I don't even feel all that sorry for the hero himself. Friends and best friends and wives can forget those fallen in battle. But somewhere there was one soul, another groba pomnit будет, she will remember to the grave. Amidst all the hypocrisy of our affairs and the banality and triviality, unique among what I have observed, unique in the world, are sacred, sincere tears. Those are the tears, бедных матерей, those are the tears of poor mothers. Им не забыть своих детей. They don't forget their children, погибших на кровавой ниве, who perish on the bloody battlefield. Как не понять, just as a weeping willow can never straighten out its branches, okay? Как не понять плохую шаиве своих поникнувших ветвей, just as a weeping willow can never bring its branches up so that they're straight. So now I had been forced to memorize that way back to college, but it was so dear to me and so expressive and so real, in my view, that it came out okay, and it came out actually without any problems. And I looked at the audience there, and it was an inspiration. I had to recite that poem because, it was very poignant looking at their reaction. Not so much that it was an American reciting this, but that the poet Nekrasov had said it all, okay? And all of them, without exception, had someone fallen in that war, and some of them not long after that fateful date on the 22nd of June, 1941, when Hitler turned around and invaded Russia. A big mistake, of course, but one thing to remember is that the U.S. and Great Britain have been really good at pretending over the last 5-7 years that the U.S. and the U.K. won the war. That's what Normandy was all about. I hope my American listeners will not look askance at my telling them that that's not quite right, that the Russians had already turned the Nazi hordes around, that they did help when Normandy was invaded with this Operation Bagration, where they really just tore into what was left of the German tank armies. But it was the Russians that won the war. They would have taken longer to win it had we not gone into Normandy and come up around Italy and so forth. But that's the main reality there. And put yourself in a Russian shoes and listen to British and Americans bragging about having won that war, especially with the 27 million casualties. Now, the other part of that, of course, and this is important, is we helped them immensely. In those days, we were allies. We had a common enemy, okay? And I had one very poignant moment when I was in Moscow to celebrate the meeting on the Elbe in East Germany, when the Russian forces and the U.S. forces finally met. April of 1945, so just a month before the end of the war in Europe, okay? And they met, and I was at a celebration of that meeting on the Elbe, and I also had a chance to talk at that one. Well, after that one, a great, very tall general in Soviet uniform, he was about 6'5". He came up to me and he looked at me, and he didn't speak any English, but what he said was this: now, hang on here and get the full significance of this. He looks, he says, Studebaker. 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 Great big Russian bear hug. Okay. Well, some of your audience will know that the automobile plant Studebaker in our Midwest turned its production line all over to making Jeeps and armored vehicles and the kind of things that tow artillery, and that almost 1 million such went up through Iran into the theater where this general was fighting. He was probably a major or a colonel at that point, okay? So what he wanted, all he remembered in English was the most significant thing that happened to him during that war, and that was Studebaker. It was a very moving remembrance of the role we did play and how we could have actually kept playing that role to keep a peace in Europe if there were a measure of confidence and not a measure of this, oh, we won the war and the Russians are on their back. They lost 27 million. We lost 400,000. Their country is destroyed. We can work our will in the world, and we need to make sure that we keep the disproportionate amount of natural resources and influence that we had at the end of the war. And no other than George Kennan wrote a paper saying precisely that. We can't be diverted by considerations of human rights or things like that. It'll come to the exercise of raw power, because we have domain over 50% of the world's natural resources, but only 9% of the world's population. Okay, and so the natural conclusion from that is we have to do everything we can to maintain that disequilibrium. Now, that was the policy, okay? Now, I learned later, George Kennan, bright as he was pretty much an elite person, who really was America first and the rest of the world can go fend for themselves. But think about that. That was 1948. It was the first policy planning paper from the State Department, okay? So, wow. what we were one ninth of the population in the world. What are we now? Sort of like 4%, I think. And how much in control are we of the world's natural resources? Well, I dare say it's not 50% anymore. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is that we have to say, well, things have changed, okay? And we can't work our will in the world as we used to. We're no longer so exceptional or indispensable that we could do the kinds of things we used to. And there are glimmers of hope. In a Foreign Affairs magazine article just this week, that say, you really need to look at U.S. foreign policy, recognize the new situation, and trim your sails accordingly. Now, trim your sails. Well, I'll do another analogy. How long does it take to have a aircraft carrier make a U-turn? Okay, well, it takes a long time, and it's a really cumbersome way of doing it. And that's a good analogy for how long it takes a foreign policy approach to change. But there are glimmers of hope that some people, and this was a prominent member of the Obama administration, writing in Foreign Affairs, the quintessential prestigious magazine, saying, look, we ought to get off our high horse. George Kennan was right after the war. That's no longer the case. Witness what we're seeing now. And when the Houthis down there in the Red Sea can contend with a aircraft carrier and other accompanying ships that we put against them, we ought to take a lesson from that, because, well, we ought to take a lesson from that and trim our sails, so to speak.